Good evening. We're going to look at a question that I was asked recently about Passover. And actually, this is a pretty common question. Every year it kind of comes up, so I thought it'd be good to maybe answer, and maybe this will be helpful. Obviously, Passover is one of the first Moedims of the year, or appointed times of the year. And if you go to Leviticus 23, you'll read through that chapter, and it lists Yahuwah's, who's the creator, his appointed times. And it's basically a calendar laid out where he has special events, appointments where he is ready to meet with his people and reveal more of basically his plan. And Passover starts really that whole cycle. Then it goes into unleavened bread, Feast of Weeks, trumpets in the fall, Day of Atonements, Sukkot, and Shemini Atzeret, or the eighth day, is the last one. So for a lot of people that are new to maybe coming into a Torah obedience and really trying to rehearse and put these things into practice, it's just really cool to get in sync with the creator and what he is doing on his calendar. And Passover is just an exciting time, and unleavened bread to celebrate him. And so if you're new to all this, this will be a very important question. When is Passover? When do we celebrate it? And it's kind of interesting because it's kind of a dispute every year, but hopefully today we'll kind of look at the scripture a little bit, and maybe it won't be as confusing as we go through it. So I hope this helps a little bit, and look forward to hearing a little bit of feedback. All right, well, without further ado, let's jump in and look at when is the Passover. We're going to look at 5 key points that I think are going to be really helpful in being able to sync the Passover and really, I think, understand it a lot better. And the first thing we just need to know is the date of Passover. What does the scripture actually say the date is? And this is the first part of information we really need to be able to figure out when is the Passover. So we're just going to go right through the scripture and just read a few of these. This won't be exhaustive, but it'll be just enough to give you a good understanding of what's going on. So let's go ahead and jump on in. On the 14th day of the first month, between the evenings, is the Passover of Yahuwah. Leviticus 23:5. And they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at even in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that Yahuwah commanded Moses. So did the children of Israel. Numbers 9:5. And in the first month, on the 14th day, is the Passover of Yahuwah. Numbers 28:16. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. Joshua 5:10. Moreover, Josiah kept the Passover unto Yahuwah in Jerusalem, and they killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 1. And the children of the captivity kept the Passover upon the 14th day of the first month. Ezra 6:19. Okay, now we're going to look at a question. According to the scripture, what is the date of Passover? A, is it day 13 of month 1? Or B, is it day 14 of month 1? Or C, is it day 15 of month 1? If you answered B, the 14th day of the first month, you are correct, and congratulations. And I asked my children this very same question. Even my 3-year-old got it right. So it's not very difficult when you actually go through the scripture and just read what's there. It's pretty straightforward. And if for some reason you did not get answer B for that question, go back and review the first couple scriptures I just read. But moving on, we need to look at some other things before we can really truly figure out when is Passover. Now that we know that Passover falls on day 14 of month 1, the next step into really locking down when the Passover is looking at what phase of the day did this kind of event start or fall on. And in order to do that, we need to look briefly at the anatomy of a Hebrew day. So in Genesis 1:5, it is written, Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, day one. And as you keep going through the narrative of Genesis chapter 1, you'll have the creation story account, and basically day 2 there will be a created thing, and then this kind of catchphrase, the evening and morning, day 2. Day 3, then it will give a creation count, either evening and morning in day 3, and it'll just keep going like that all the way down to day 6. And it's interesting because really there's basically 4 key phases to a Hebrew day, and it starts really in the evening, which is a little bit different than the typical calendar you may see on the wall, or the whole New Year thing where it's at midnight. The Hebrew calendar actually starts at sunset or in the evening, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. The 4 phases of the Hebrew day go from evening, which transitions into night, night transitions into morning, and morning transitions into day. So the 4 phases are evening, night, morning, day. It's pretty simple. And there's a huge thematic teaching. We're not going to get into it too much, but the whole idea of even Jacob's trouble and the time of darkness, and versus the time of the Messianic era, which is the dawning of the day type of a thing. So the idea that the darkness comes first is not necessarily a new concept, but this kind of goes throughout the scripture. But it's kind of important to understand these different phases of the day. The evening and morning are almost like the stitches or the connecting pieces that connects the day to the night and the night to the day. And these transition points are going to be really critical to understand, because there's a lot of things that go on in the evening and the morning. For example, like the sacrifices, the offerings normally would happen at that time. So that'll be critical for what we're going to be looking at. So to answer our question, what phase of the Hebrew day was the Passover killed? We have basically 4 options here. We have the evening, we have the night, we have the morning, and the day. So we're going to just go right to the scripture and see what it teaches, and it's pretty straightforward when you actually read it. And the place where Yahuwah your Elohim chooses to make his name dwell, there you shall slaughter the Passover in the evening at the going down of the sun, at the appointed time you came out of Egypt. Deuteronomy 16:6. That sounds pretty straightforward. In the evening, at the going down of the sun. Um, and let's just continue here. There's a few verses we've already read, but you can notice that even the Numbers 9:5 passage, specifically, not only does it say the 14th first day of the month, but at even. And also in the Joshua passage, it says the same thing, at even. It connects this whole idea in the evening. Now here's another passage that's interesting, and it also kind of connects this idea of evening. We're going to talk more about that word evening here in a second, but let's go ahead and read this passage. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, and the lamb for each household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons, depending on what each person can eat. You shall divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. Exodus 12:3-6. So this is interesting because we just got to read in Deuteronomy where it said the slaughter of the Passover in the evening at the going down of the sun. And here in Exodus, it kind of makes mention of this Passover, but instead of using at the going down of the sun, it says between the evenings. Now, we're going to talk about this because that word for evening, spelled Ayin, Resh, Bet, Arab, if you really don't have the vowel points and things like that, basically where we get that word Arab, Arabia. And one of the meanings of that, besides evening and even, is mixing or to mingle. And it's really interesting. I really like that meaning because when you really think about what evening is during that period, it's where there's a transition between um, it's a mingling of the light and the darkness a little bit. So basically the transition of the day in between the evenings. So in between that, the mixing is when they were supposed to kill the Passover, and this would be right after sunset. And this is really huge because this is right at the beginning of the day. It's a transition point in the day. That's why they were supposed to keep the Passover until the 14th day at that point when it started. Now, here's another passage that uses the between the evenings and kind of can tie into also Passovers. Leviticus 23:5. On the 14th day of the first month, between the evenings, is the Passover of Yahuwah. And here again, we have that expression between the evenings. And you can see in this little diagram here, it's right after sunset. It's basically the time between sunset and basically where night's at. So it's kind of this that uh, that part in between, the evening part. And specifically, this is interesting because not only is it a transition of a day, but that's also when we normally cite the new moon too. So the calendar is in sync. And in Psalm 104, verse 19, it says, He made the moon for the seasons, or moedim, and the sun knows the place of its setting. So it's really cool that the fact that when the sun goes down, and at the end of the month, it's right at that time between the evenings we normally see the new moon to clarify the new, the new month, declare it right there at the beginning of the day. And it just makes a lot of sense. Paul makes reference to this in a twinkling of an eye at the last trump, when the moon is at normally spot during this in between the evenings. So throughout Scripture, you'll see for example, Aaron lit the menorah, um, the lamps between the evenings, and also the quail came between the evenings, and the manna came in the morning. The two um, stitches of the day, you could say, or transition points. Also, the sacrifices were also done between the evenings, and the other one was done in the morning. So this is just a really key part of the day, and and it's basically four sacrifices anyway. So it just makes a lot of sense that this specific offering was given between the evenings. Here is another um, passage, and this diagram will make it a little bit easier to see. And we already read the Deuteronomy 16:6, but I'm going to read it one more time because there's a little something people kind of miss in here. But at the time where but at the place where Yahuwah, your Elohim, chooses to make his name dwell, there you shall slaughter or kill the Passover in the evening at the going down of the sun. At the appointed time you came out of Egypt. Now this is really interesting because this is Deuteronomy 16, but at the beginning of that chapter it says, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto Yahuwah your Elohim. For in the month of Abib, Yahuwah um, your Elohim brought you out of Egypt by night. And this is interesting. And also in Exodus it says, it is a night to be observed unto Yahuwah for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This night is unto Yahuwah to be observed by all the children of Israel throughout their generations. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but you got to read the whole entire context of that. But Israel, this is kind of a prophecy that Yah talks about on that same day in chapter 12 of Exodus, that he was going to bring them out on the seventh day of unleavened bread, which is the 21st day of the first month, but by night. And this is interesting because it talks about at the going down of the sun for the Passover at the point in time you came out of Egypt. And they started making their trek across the Red Sea that night, at the beginning of that night, and they made it all the way across. And by morning, their enemy was covered. And it's really important because that is the same timing of the Passover. It really sinks it and lets you know that this wasn't offered in the afternoon. This wasn't offered, in the morning. The Passover was offered in the evening, And also the Exodus, or the passing through the Red Sea. This happened in the evening and went all through the night, and through the morning their enemies were covered over in water by that time. So this is a really key point. So they came out by night. Now that we have covered two basic points, the date of Passover, the 14th day of the first month, and also that Passover, the phase of the day that it happens is the evening, or between the evenings. There's still like a controversy sometimes, because people, maybe because they don't understand the definition of when a day starts, they get confused and maybe think, well, maybe it's the evening of that starts the 15th. And there's actually people that really think the Passover is on the 15th, although there is really no scripture whatsoever that will ever say the Passover is on the 15th day of the first month. Matter of fact, we'll actually look at one that will totally prove that not to be the case at all. The 15th day of the first month is the first day of unleavened bread, a completely different um, festival, even though they're close to one another, like Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. They're close, they're distinct. So I think this next section, if you're having issues with this, it'll help clear this up. And this is called the rites of Passover. A lot of people just assume Passover was just this offering done and that was it. But there was a lot of other instructions given, rites and ceremonies given for the children of Israel to do throughout the 14th. And once you realize that and see a little bit of the historic Passover, it really sinks it to the beginning of the 14th, at even on the 14th and not the 15th. So it's exactly what the scripture says. So without further ado, let's kind of look at these rites of the Passover. On the 14th day of this month, between the evenings, you shall keep it at its appointed time, according to all its rites and ceremonies, you shall keep it. Numbers 9:3. So we're going to start off and look at a day. Again, looking at sunset. And this is a picture of the 14th day. And we're going to kind of look at what happened in the historical Exodus, and hopefully this will make a lot more sense once you see kind of a little bit of the layout. Not all the details are here, but enough to give you some chronology and basically understand the difference between the 14th and the 15th. So Passover starts at sundown on the 14th. And I'm going to read a few of these scriptures. And you shall keep it unto the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. It's between that transition area again. We keep on continuing reading. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the upper lintel of the house, where they will eat it. And they shall eat the flesh that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and shall eat it with bitter herbs. It's important to understand that they were to also, that same night they killed the Passover, they were to put the blood upon the doorposts, and also that they were to eat the flesh of it that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And as we keep reading, there was other instructions for them to do that very night. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. And that which remains until morning you shall burn with fire. So again, this is on the 14th. And this next one is really important. None of you shall go out of the doors of your house until morning. So no one left anywhere until morning. Exodus 12:22b. And the children of Israel went away and did so. They did exactly as Yahuwah commanded Moses and Aaron. And it came to pass at midnight that Yahuwah struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captivity who was in the dungeon, all the firstborn of livestock. Exodus 12:28-29. So I have a question. Did Israel leave on the night of Passover? And the answer is quite obvious when we look at the scriptures we just read. The answer is no. They did not leave on Passover night. Matter of fact, no one left their house. It says, and none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. And this is a huge thing, because a lot of people think they got up and left that night, and they did not. And if you keep continuing to reading in chapter 11, um, and I think maybe in chapter 13 too, it'll talk about Pharaoh, like obviously getting up in the night, and that there was a dead one in every single one of the houses, and they called for Aaron and Moses. But a lot of people read into that or watch movies where Moses then went to Pharaoh, but the scripture does not say that at all. They read that into the scripture, and it's just not there. They did not leave the house. Matter of fact, in other texts like the book of Yasher, it even mentions that they stayed there. So, I mean, not to use those quotes, you can just see it from the scripture itself that none of them went outside the house. It said they yet were obedient. They did exactly as Yahuwah had commanded Moses and Aaron. So no one left. No one left the night of Passover. They stayed in their houses as they were commanded. Now, the next day was Passover day. Obviously, they were ready to go. Uh, they were supposed to be ready, had their shoes on, everything ready to go, because in the morning they were going to plunder the Egypts. All the 14th day, I'll just read the scripture. And the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses. They had asked from the Egyptians objects of silver, objects of gold, and garments. And Yahuwah gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, so that they gave them what they asked, and they plundered the Egyptians. So all that day they're gathering stuff, and they're preparing to Exodus. They have not yet left yet. They're still gathering stuff and organizing themselves to leave. And now the scripture is very specific in when they actually left Ramses to head to Sukkot. And we'll read the first verse, and the next one will actually give us the date. And the children of Israel set out from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides little ones. A mixed multitude went up with them too, also flocks and herds, very much livestock. Exodus 12:37 and 38. Then in the book of Numbers, it also tells us the date that this happened. So they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. Now this is important. On the morrow after the Passover. So the Passover is not the 15th. The 15th is the morrow after the Passover. The Passover was on the 14th. The first day of unleavened bread, the day they left, is the 15th. And this is really important to understand. This actually splits the two right here. The children of Israel went out with boldness before the eyes of all of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were bearing all their firstborn whom Yahuwah had smitten among them, and also on their mighty ones Yahuwah had executed judgment. Then the children of Israel departed Ramses and camped at Sukkot. And throughout these first couple of days, at Sukkot, they're on the 16th. They're gathering the bones of Joseph, and they're doing a few stops before they get the pillar, and they start traveling even by day and night. But nevertheless, this is kind of what was going on that day. And you can kind of see that there's a lot of people that think the Passover was on the 15th at evening, and they actually believe they left right there because of these scriptures I just read in Numbers, that they headed out and left, and they call that the night that they left. But that's not the case, because on Passover, none of them should go out of his house until morning. So they have some really problems trying to fit the 15th, which the scripture does not say it is the Passover, into the Passover, when it clearly is not. So these are some of the problems, and hopefully you can see it here as it's laid out. But we're going to continue on. Another issue is that once you understand that Passover is to be eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I'll just read this quote from Exodus 12:15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first until the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So here we have 7 days of unleavened bread here, but also if you add Passover, where you're supposed to have unleavened bread, it makes a total of 8 days of unleavened bread. And the term unleavened bread is kind of, I mean, it kind of is the whole feast. Sometimes we say that for Sukkot. We even add in Shmini Atzeret, or Passover could be all 8 days. But the key here is that it's actually an 8-day festival when you count the beginning of, if you're counting it correctly. As a matter of fact, Josephus, who was a priest during this time before the Second Temple was destroyed, actually, I have a little quote down here. He says this: "We keep for 8 days a festival called unleavened bread." So if like a lot of people try to keep Passover on the 15th. Well, if you keep it from the 15th at even to the 21st, that's only 7 days. So you can that should tell you right there that you actually start your count from the beginning of the 14th, as the scripture says, on the 14th day at evening. Evening is at the beginning of the day, and once you understand that, it makes so much more sense. And once you realize there's 8 days of eating unleavened bread, including Passover, with the other 7 days from the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it makes perfect sense. So this is also helpful to understand that there's an 8-day festival. The last thing we're going to look at, I think, is really key to kind of understanding the timing of the Passover for those who have the understanding of Messiah and him being the spotless Lamb of Elohim. He actually ate the Passover at the time appointed by Scripture, which it makes absolute complete sense. And we're not going to spend time going through every single passage here. I'm going to do some other little mini teachings and talk about the death, burial, and resurrection, and we'll get into this a little bit more. And we kind of have left out the book of John. I'm going to actually talk about that in detail too, because that seems like it's a stumbling block for a lot of people. They don't, for some reason, they don't know how to sync it with the rest of these accounts. But nevertheless, I do want to look at Matthew and see what Messiah actually did. And this is Yahusha speaking in this quote here. And he, Yahusha, said, "Go into the city to a certain man, and you shall say to him," and this is in the year of his crucifixion when he was talking to his disciples, "The teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my taught ones," or disciples. And the taught ones did as Yahusha had ordered them and prepared the Passover. I don't know how anyone could read these passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke and not think Messiah did not keep the Passover when it flat out says, when he tells his disciples, "I am to keep the Passover at your house with my taught ones," as he would send them off to a certain man. I mean, if Messiah says this in the scripture, you know, if he says what he means, I don't know how people get around it. I've heard teachers say, well, maybe no, he didn't really mean that. They were having a little dinner with the disciples. It wasn't Passover, but they just totally read over these verses. I mean, it's just crazy to me because it's just plain as can be, and it's in every account. And John has a little bit different. He's coming at it from a different day, but nevertheless, it flat out says, "I am to keep the Passover at your house with my taught ones." And they went and prepared the Passover. So, yeah, people have a problem with this, but this is what actually happened. Also in Matthew, we see that in Matthew 26:26, and as they were eating, Yahushua took bread and having blessed, broke, and gave it to the taught ones and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." And also in Matthew 27, 20 through 29, and taking the cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood, that of the renewed covenant, which is shed for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I shall certainly not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in the reign of my Father." And This is a huge, because we're going to get into the meaning of Passover, why is Passover so significant, and talk about this renewed covenant, because this is really what it's all about. He was renewing the covenant with his people Israel, and whosoever would actually join them. So that's an important part, and we don't want to overlook that, obviously, because the meaning of Passover is really significant. But you can see that he clearly was taking part of the bread and the wine, almost the symbols of Melchizedek back in Genesis. We definitely see the same picture here. So when we look at just kind of a brief timeline of Messiah's life, or the passion, the time from the death on the 14th, and in connection to the 15th, we see that they ate the Passover at the beginning, and even Paul writes about this in Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26, and this is what he wrote: "For I have received from the Master that which I have also delivered to you, that the Master Yahusha, in the night in which he was delivered up, took bread, and having given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, also the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the renewed covenant in my blood. As often as you drink it, do this in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Master until he comes.'" Now, what's important with this is not only did Messiah participate in the Passover, and when we actually participate in the Passover, when he did, we're doing this in remembrance of him. But that very night he was taken, just like the firstborn in Egypt were taken. Now the firstborn Elohim was taken during the night, and it was during the day portion of the 14th that he was put on the stake. And by the 9th hour, sometime after that, he cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Now it's interesting that at that time they were in a rush to kind of get him down from the stake, because the high Sabbath of the 15th was approaching. So again, this kind of shows you that he ate the Passover, but he was also the Passover lamb, and fulfilled what Genesis, I believe, is 22:8, where Abraham speaks to Isaac. Um, Elohim provides himself the lamb, and really, this is what the Lamb of Elohim sacrifice is all about. It's interesting, the high priest, when they were the last ones to sacrifice, would say it is finished. So on the 14th day, he's still on Passover day. Um, he still is a picture of that Passover lamb, and this is significant when we're understanding the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah as well. So, real briefly, when is the Passover? We're going to look at one last slide. Okay, here's the takeaways. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier um, to determine when is Passover. We first looked at the date of Passover, which the scripture clearly says is the 14th day of the first month. Then we looked at the timing within the days. What phase? Was it in the evening? Was it at night? Was it in the morning or day? The scripture tells us it was at the going down of the sun. It was in the evening, between the evenings. So we know Passover is not only on the 14th day of the first month, but it's also at sunset. And sunset is what begins the day. We also looked at the rites of Passover and saw how on the 14th, not only were they supposed to slay it, but they were supposed to apply blood to the doorposts. They weren't supposed to go outside of their house until morning, and they were supposed to burn any remains if there was any leftover before morning as well. And this also proves that no one left the house. They didn't exodus that night. They didn't leave. They stayed there. And the next day, they actually plundered the Egyptians to prepare to leave for Ramses by the 15th. And then we looked at, also to sync things, is the fact that Passover and unleavened bread combined is an 8-day festival, showing that the only way you can get that, you can't get it if you start Passover on the 15th through the 21st, but you can only get an 8-day festival if you start from the beginning of the 14th and go all the way through the 21st. And last but not least, Obviously, Messiah is the example we ought to follow, and he ate the Passover in the correct time with his disciples, and he instructed them to go prepare the Passover, and that he was going to eat it with them. And it's clear as day when you actually read through the scriptures and see that he actually ate it at the time that was prescribed in the Torah on day 14, month 1, between the evenings. So they would kill it there and then eat it during that night. Um, but yeah, hopefully this helps a little bit. I know it's kind of maybe a little bit of information, but it wasn't too exhaustive. But I hope this clarifies a little bit. To me, it's pretty simple. I will, I think, try to do something with the book of John, since I haven't really mentioned any much here, and also we'll look into the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah, because this is a very important subject. The Passover and what it really represents is him confirming, restoring, renewing the covenant of old in Jeremiah 31:31, where he was going to write the Torah on the hearts of the house of Israel and the house of Yehuda, and really reconnect them. This is a big part of the work of Messiah, is to by the Spirit write the Torah on our hearts. That's really what the new covenant's all about. So we want to press into the things he has for us, and we would want to rehearse these, because in the book of Colossians it tells us that these are a shadow of good things to come, and we want to be faithful and obedient and be prepared for the second Exodus that's soon ahead. Thank you. Shalom.